or underwriters.
And that means it's time for Talk of the Bay on KSQD 90.7, 89.7, and 89.5. I'm your host, Rachel Ann Goodman, and today we speak with neuropsychiatrist Anthony Feinstein about a new book, Moral Courage. He's interviewed investigative journalists who risk their freedom and their lives to report from the front lines of wars and repressive regimes. What drives them, along with aid workers and other dedicated people, to persist in their mission? We'll find out what they had to say and what they had in common as we look at all of the conflict areas around the world and the people that are keeping us informed. Stay tuned. And welcome, Anthony. Thank you for being here on Talk of the Bay. Thank you for making yourself available from Toronto. How are you doing, Anthony?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm wonderful. And you said it was early winter, late fall up there, correct?
Beautiful day today. Yep, really lovely.
Oh, good. You've written an amazing book, and I want to talk to you about what you learned talking to all these journalists from around the world about what kind of dangers they encountered. And I wanted to start out with the title of your book, because it seems like we're watching moral courage evaporate in some places around the world and in governments, including our own at times. How do you define moral courage, and why did you want to write a book about it now?
Well, you've touched on a couple of things in your introduction. I've been studying journalists and how they deal with stressful situations for a long time, over 20 years. And it's become clear to me that the media is under tremendous pressure in many parts of the world. Authoritarian regimes, dictatorial leaders know that if they want to control their societies, they need to control the media. They want to destroy a free press. And in many of the countries that I focused on, places like Russia, Belarus, Azerbaijan, Bangladesh, etc., the last vestiges of civil society often lie with journalists. And there's this very small group of journalists who show an extraordinary courage in standing up for freedom of expression, freedom of the press, and democracy. So the book focuses on these individuals, and they display what I feel is a common denominator, something that binds them all together in terms of motivation, and that's their moral courage. And it comes from a confluence of a number of factors. Number one, you've got to have principles of democracy, of fairness, of openness. You then need to be in a situation in which it's dangerous, and it certainly is in these countries. And then you've got to have the endurance or the willpower to act. And when you combine those three ingredients, your principles, your desire to act, the fact you do act on them, against the backdrop of danger, you've got something called moral courage.
And when you spoke to people, some of them were on the run in other countries. They had been attempted assassinations against their lives. Tell some of the stories. They're really gripping. And as someone who works in media, I was so in awe of their bravery. The first person you interview is from South Africa, which during apartheid was a dangerous place to be writing about what was happening, including after the transition out of apartheid. It's continued to be. Could you talk about her and her story a little bit?
Right. So you're referring to Gwen Lister, and she is South African, grew up under apartheid. And her story is remarkable because as a young child, she recalled traveling on a bus in Cape Town, South Africa. And during the apartheid era, the buses were segregated. White people could sit, they were double-decker buses. White people could sit, on the first of the ground floor, as it were, but black people had to climb the stairs and sit above. And there was this young girl sitting at the front of a bus, being white. She was sitting in seats reserved for white people. And she recalls this elderly black woman getting on the bus, laden down with parcels, and she instinctively got up to give this woman her seat. She realized that it would be very difficult for this woman to make it up these winding stairs in a moving bus. And this spontaneous act brought down fury on her from the other white passengers, sitting in the white section. But it's something that she felt that she had to do. And that kind of moral integrity that was there as a child has followed her for the rest of her life. So she ended up going to university. She made a stand against apartheid. Then she decided she wanted to go into journalism. She realized that for her to have a more immediate impact, she wouldn't be able to do it in South Africa. So she went to live in the neighboring territory of what was then called Southwest Africa, which is now called Namibia. And that was a country controlled by South Africa, although the United Nations said this was an illegal occupation. South Africa controlled Namibia, and Gwen Lister went to work there as a journalist. And, to cut a long story short, over the course of many years, she was instrumental in founding a free press, promoting democratic institutions, and taking on the South African government that was occupying the country. And in the process, she paid a very high price. She ended up starting her own newspaper called The Namibian. Offices were firebombed. People would drive past and shoot bullets into the offices. She was arrested. She was detained. She was constantly harassed online. She feels that the pressures of living in this kind of white-hot vortex of opposition, cost her relationships with her partners. So she paid a very high price in that way for just sticking to her moral compass. But at the end of the day, democracy ran out, and she was instrumental in helping this country reach independence and become a democratic country. So a very remarkable woman. And then she said something to me which was really quite intriguing. She was spending some time with a religious leader in Namibia, a bishop, a black man, who turned around and said to her, whatever made a little white girl like you do such a thing? Referring to her getting up on the bus and giving up her seat, and then having a life devoted to helping a democratic movement. And Gwen wasn't quite sure. She didn't quite understand, what motivated her other than to know that this was something that was right, something that was correct. You had to do this. And so one of the tasks in my interview was to try and tease out, what were the factors motivating her to do something like this, and come to the conclusion that she had this moral courage. But where did the moral courage come from? And it comes from a sense of moral injury, that individuals have a sense that things are not morally correct, that acts and behaviors that transgress one's moral compass. And that can be deeply distressing to people. It's distressing to see how you can have a morally egregious system like apartheid. It's morally distressing to see how people enforce apartheid so brutally. But then you can also have people keeping silent in the face of injustice, an act of omission, and that in itself can cause moral injury. So you see two sources of moral injury: the behavior of other people, or things that you might do, but things that you fail to do by keeping quiet in the face of what is clearly a morally compromised situation.
And I'm curious. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you. I'm curious how someone whose background is in neuropsychiatry got interested in this particular topic.
Oh, that's a good question. So my day job is I run a multiple sclerosis research team, which is very different from the topic we're talking about. But I have a clinical practice as well. And about 2 decades back, I was referred a fascinating patient who came from the neurological service because they thought that she had a neurological disorder. But she got a clean bill of health from the neurologist. All the brain scans were negative. And she turned out to have a very severe stress reaction. And after she recovered, I learned that she was a frontline journalist who'd been working in East Africa covering very difficult stories. And she was a fascinating patient. She'd seen the world. She'd gone to war zones. She'd covered revolutions, etc. And I remember saying to her, you were out in the field and you knew you were getting into trouble emotionally. Why did you not reach out for help? And she said to me, you don't understand my profession. She said, if you let on that you're weak, they'll never send you back into the field. And I saw that as a very punitive way of dealing with people. And so I took a break from my MS research for a while, and we did a literature search on what was written on journalists and trauma and emotions. And we never found a single publication, not one. And so he wrote a grant, sent it to the Freedom Forum in Washington, D.C., and he ended up doing the very first study of looking at journalists confronting war and revolution. And that started my interest in this area, which really was a neglected area of research. What about journalists who have very dangerous lives, who take on dangerous regimes, who cover war, etc.? Investigative journalists who want to expose crime and corruption in very dangerous places. And this work on moral courage is an offshoot of my interest in journalism.
And you also had a documentary, Under Fire, which won a Peabody Award, which was about this topic, correct, in Namibia, talking about the study of mental health in journalists.
Yeah, it was Under Fire, and it came from some of my work. I published a book with Johns Hopkins University Press, basically describing the pressures and dangers that come with frontline journalism and how this affects the mental health of journalists, and that was turned into a documentary. Yeah.
That's fantastic. Now, you went to talking to journalists who are in Iran and Russia. Let's take those two countries, and then I want to talk about, if you could, what's happening in the Middle East right now and how that fits into your book that you wrote.
Right.
So what about Iran first? Yeah.
Yeah. So there is an Iranian journalist in my book, and he is now living in exile in the United States. His name is Mohammad Mossayed, and his story is fascinating because he grew up in a poor family. His father was a teacher, and as a kid, his father taught in a school that had two rooms. One room was a classroom, and the other room was where the family lived. Muhammad with his parents and a sibling. And they were extremely poor. They, he would say that there was limited electricity. You had to choose between, putting on the stove or putting on the lights, because otherwise there was not enough electricity to go around. And those were his memories of childhood. And he was left wondering, why were we so poor when my father was a well-educated man? And as he grew into adulthood, he became aware of many injustices in Iran, including terrible corruption. And he started to write about corruption. He obviously had a gift for writing, and the Iranian readers responded very well to him. But of course, writing like this wasn't to be tolerated in such an intolerant country like Iran. And so the regime came after him, and they tried to silence the newspapers that he worked for. And the editors would say to him, you have to be careful. You can't write like this. And the editors started to self-censor. They were too scared to publish what he was writing. And that was unacceptable to him. So he took to social media to basically express his views and developed a very large following in Iran. And the government, once again, started to come after him. They came after his girlfriend. They arrested his girlfriend. They arrested him.
Wasn't he tortured as well?
He was tortured as well, yeah. And the manner of his arrest was very traumatic because he went to stay with his parents. And he told me that he woke up. He'd gone to bed. He woke up, and there were these strange people in his room filming him and basically going through his possessions. And they brought along they were from the Iranian Internal Security Agency, and they brought along a woman to essentially restrain his mother should she become upset. And then they took him away and locked him up and tortured him. And then he got out on bail and used it as an opportunity to flee. And he fled across mountains into Turkey.
Not known for its very liberal press either, yeah. I might add.
Mm-hmm.
He was sort of fleeing the frying pan into the fire in a way if he was going to write about Turkey, but maybe he just stayed quiet for a while.
He did, and he waited, and he got help from wonderful organizations like CPJ, the Committee to Protect Journalists, and then made his way to the United States, where he was joined by his partner as well. But a horrendous experience and very traumatic for him. One of the things that when he got bail, his father had to put up the house as surety. And one of the things that Mohammed feels very bad about is because he basically skipped the country while out on bail, the government potentially has a lien on his parents' home.
Yeah, that must
And
be horrible.
yeah, a lot of guilt and a lot of emotional pain and things like that. But, this is a man who knew what he was doing. He was consciously aware of what he was doing. He felt that he could not keep quiet. He saw so many egregious acts by the Iranian government that it basically offended him in a way that he felt he couldn't keep quiet. For him, keeping quiet was worse than the regime coming after him.
I just heard
And I
an
think
interview today with a gentleman who resigned from his post with our government, which he said in his resignation letter that he could no longer, just pass along arms to Israel from our country anymore. Like that was his job. He was an intelligence officer as well, and he just said, I can't do this anymore because we're killing children, and he resigned. Maybe that's moral courage too, because when he did major public interviews about what he felt was wrong that the government was doing with our arms and making money off these sales. And he went very public, and I thought, he's not a journalist, but he's showing a lot of moral courage to stand up to his own government and reveal what he knew. And that's,
you come back to the definition of moral injury that I mentioned earlier, which is a condition that can arise from perpetrating, witnessing, or failing to prevent acts that transgress your moral compass. And so, by keeping quiet, some people can develop a sense of real moral disquiet, and the antidote to that is speaking up. And I think this is a theme that united all 19 journalists in my book.
If you just joined me, I'm speaking with Anthony Feinstein. He's author of Moral Courage. And Mr. Feinstein, I wanted to ask you about our current situation and the journalists that are covering the war between Israel and Hamas. Do you have any thoughts about this moment and the moral courage? I know that some universities are silencing students who protest, which is a First Amendment right. Places like Harvard, and these are supposed to be the places where we foster intellectual curiosity and open dialogue. So I wondered what your thoughts are about this moment of moral courage or moral cowardice that we might be seeing on some people's part.
Yeah, well, it's a fraud situation, isn't it? I mean, the Hamas attacks were so terrible, there was no morality to that as well. It was an absolutely egregious act, and then how do you respond to that? And, so many innocent people get killed and hurt on both sides of this conflict, which is obviously very painful. And journalists have to cover it, and as you know, journalists are getting killed. It's interesting that in my work, I speak to both Israeli and Palestinian journalists, and they want the same thing. They want peace, they want stability, they want a place to live where they can bring up their children, they want food on the table, they want to make a living. We all share this common humanity, and it goes out the window when war visits and communities are destroyed. And you become aware of the poignancy of it. In my interaction with these journalists, I don't hear them expressing animosity for the other side. All they're asking is to lead the kind of life that we all want to lead, which is, one of a peaceful coexistence, and it's, a safe place to raise families. And I think that's the pain of it. I think there's so many things that unite people, that bind them together, and it tends to get lost in the pain of war and conflict.
Yeah, there's the old saying that the first casualty of war is the truth, and that's very difficult to figure out in the middle of battle what's even happening. There was, one disputed explosion that damaged a hospital at the beginning of the war, and we still don't exactly know what happened, but there's starting to be a coalesced reality around that based on the little evidence. But it's an example of trying to report the truth. So, whatever you can figure out in the middle of a conflict is a very difficult thing.
In the fog of war, I agree. And I think, the principle of journalists being allowed to report freely is something that I believe in quite passionately, that one should not silence the media.
Yeah, it's not good in any case. And I know there have been a lot of deaths of journalists in Gaza in the past month. I think it's up to 26 now. It's a very high number.
A lot of journalists have died, yes. Yep.
Yeah, it's quite a large number. I want to finish up with talking about Russia. There's plenty of other countries that reach high in the oppressiveness against journalists, but Russia, since there's a war going on there as well,
Yes.
I thought you would talk about what you learned talking to David Frankel.
Yeah, so there are two Russian journalists in my book, one alive and one dead, sadly. And David Frankel didn't start out life as a journalist. He was a physicist. And he was also obviously a man with a very finely tuned moral compass, saw what was going on in his country with Putin destroying democracy and felt that he couldn't keep quiet. We come back to the central message of one cannot keep quiet in the face of the way the government behaves. And so he took up his camera and started to, document human rights stories. He ended up being roughed up by some goons and having his arm broken. And he still kept working, still kept photographing human rights stories. What's interesting, this is a man who gives up a very fine career as a physicist, a very smart guy, who felt so morally outraged by the acts of the Russian government and Vladimir Putin that he was prepared to give that up, take on the uncertain life of a freelance photographer, film things, have his arm broken in the process, and still keep doing it. Now he's gone into exile with the invasion of the Ukraine. And what makes his story so fascinating is that we talk about moral courage as the antidote to moral injury, but there's also an element of learned behavior, because it turned out that David Frankel's father, who's not a professional photographer, during the old days of the Soviet Union, picked up his camera to film Jewish refuseniks, those Jews who wanted to leave the Soviet Union, who wanted to get out, of course vilified by the communist system. You weren't supposed to record them at all, but he filmed them. He surreptitiously created this visual archive of that place and time. And so you see learned behavior, because the son is now doing or was doing what his father was doing, basically forming things that the state was very unhappy about. And so he's now in exile, and he's paid a very high price for that. And the other Russian journalist, very briefly, was Anna Politkovskaya, who's very well known, who fearlessly took on the Russian government because of their actions in Chechnya and the war in Chechnya. And she never kept quiet in her condemnation of Putin. She went after him in a very open way, wrote very, very openly about her disdain for him and what this man was doing to democracy, how he was turning back the clock to the old days of the KGB, etc., etc. And she paid a terrible price because she was murdered on Putin's birthday.
Which was very calculated as a PR message to other journalists, sadly.
Exactly.
I know that when the Ukraine war broke out, when Russia invaded Ukraine, right in the aftermath, many journalists spoke out. And then there was this television reporter who kind of busted into the newscast of state television and said, lies, they're lying to you. And then, did you remember that moment? I was cheering her, but I also was worried for her.
I do. And it's interesting because the people who are prepared to do this, this is remarkable behavior, because they know that there are going to be dreadful consequences. They have a very good understanding. They're living it. They know what the price is that they will pay for something like this, and yet they still do it.
That's right.
That's the part that's remarkable. They know it. And so they represent, I think, a very small fraction of individuals who have this incredible moral courage to stand up in the face of all this adversity and speak out. And as I said at the beginning of my talk with you, they're often the very last vestiges of civil society, because these dictatorial governments have shelled out all the other institutions. The judiciary's gone. They've chased out the NGOs. There's no accountability anywhere. The judges are corrupt. Who's left? It's journalists. There's a very small group of journalists who are prepared to, stand up and say, no, this is wrong.
Yes, indeed. The book is Moral Courage. It's by Anthony Stein, and it can be found in your local bookstore. And thank you for joining us today on Talk of the Bay. I really appreciate your time and for writing this book. It's incredibly important during this moment in time.
Well, thank you so much for the interview.
Thank you for being with us here on Talk of the Bay. All right, you have a good one. I'm Rachel Ann Goodman. This is Talk of the Bay, and I appreciate you listening. It's great to have you on board. We'll be right back. We'll be talking with Jessica Kraft Carew, who's written another wonderful book called Why We Need to Be Wild. That coming up on Talk of the Bay. Stay tuned to K-Squid.